Wind howled across Colorado's snow-covered peaks as 75-year-old Jacob Sterling sat by the fire, weathered face illuminated by dancing flames. His grandson Tommy, 8 years old, sat cross-legged on the wool rug, eyes wide with anticipation. Tommy? Jacob's voice carried decades of weight, each word deliberate. Have you ever wondered how your grandfather came to own all this land? The boy tilted his head, studying the man who seemed as permanent as the mountains. Mama says you built it from nothing after the war, Grandpa. Jacob chuckled, something darker beneath the sound. His scarred hands turned pages of a leather-bound album with surprising gentleness. Not quite from nothing, boy. There was a winter back in 1883 when I was 45 years old and foolish enough to believe law and justice were the same thing. The fire popped, sparks rising like prayers. Outside, December wind rattled windows with urgency that echoed from 30 years past. Jacob's eyes grew distant, seeing beyond the comfortable parlor to something colder, more dangerous. That winter taught me something, Tommy. Sometimes a man has to choose between what's legal and what's right. And sometimes that choice costs everything you thought you knew about yourself. Tommy scooted closer. Tell me, Grandpa. Jacob settled back, leather creaking. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming younger, as if telling could bridge the years between who he was and who he had been. All right, boy, but this isn't a fairy tale. This is about justice and sacrifice, about the price a man pays when he stands up to evil. And it begins with the worst blizzard Colorado had seen in 20 years. December 1883. Snow fell like divine judgment across Frostwood Creek, Colorado, burying the town in silence deeper than graves. Jacob Sterling stood on his ranch house porch, 45 years old, and at his physical prime, watching white death accumulate against his fences. At 6'2", with shoulders broadened by 18 years of ranch work, Jacob represented everything the frontier demanded. His hands could gentle wild horses or draw a colt faster than most men could blink. Sterling Ranch stretched before him like an American dream realized through sweat and determination. 2,400 acres of prime grazing land housed 500 black Angus cattle and 47 horses that were the envy of 3 counties. The stone house, built with his own hands, stood solid as the mountains themselves. 2 massive barns rose like monuments to persistence, their lofts packed with winter feed. Between them stood the bunkhouse housing 8 loyal hands. This empire had risen from wilderness. Every fence post driven into frozen ground, every building raised against sky, every head of cattle bearing the Sterling brand represented victory against land that gave nothing freely. The ranch was worth $23,000, placing Jacob among the territory's wealthiest men. But wealth meant nothing compared to building something that would outlast its creator. Margaret Sterling had died 5 years earlier, taken by pneumonia. Jacob never remarried, pouring grief into land and into raising their daughter Elena with fierce devotion. Elena Sterling Morrison, 23 and beautiful with mountain strength and grace, had married Daniel Morrison 2 years earlier. Daniel, Harvard-educated from Denver, represented the new Western generation who fought battles with law books rather than 6 guns. Jacob respected his son-in-law, though he wondered if the young man understood frontier survival's brutal mathematics. Some problems couldn't be solved with legal precedent. Some enemies would never bow to courts and contracts. Elena and Daniel had arrived 3 days earlier for Christmas, their carriage struggling through wheel-deep snowdrifts. They brought news from Denver about railroad expansion and territorial politics, distant concerns that seemed irrelevant against keeping cattle alive through Colorado blizzards. But this morning, as Jacob watched snow fall with relentless, divine persistence, he couldn't know his daughter's visit would destroy everything he'd spent 18 years building. December 20th found Elena in Frostwood Creek, a settlement of 847 souls gathered around the railway depot. The town existed because the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad decided it should, prospering because men like Silas Crowfield understood extracting wealth from others' dreams and desperation. Elena had driven 4 miles through mounting storm for simple purposes: Christmas gifts, supplies, social obligations. She guided the sleigh with frontier-raised competence, hands steady despite wind cutting through wool like seeking blades. Frostwood Creek's main street stretched 3 blocks between depot and courthouse, lined with necessary businesses. Morrison's General Store, McCarthy's Saloon, First National Bank, Hendricks's Boarding House, and others serving ranchers, railroad workers, and occasional travelers foolish enough to venture into winter mountains. First National Bank dominated town center like a permanence declaration. Built from imported brick and local stone, it rose 2 stories above muddy streets, windows gleaming with institutional confidence. Gold letters proclaimed its president, Silas Crowfield, proprietor. Elena's morning took her first to Morrison's General Store for fabric, then the apothecary for medicines her father's aging cowboys required, finally to the bank for Daniel's law practice business. At the bank, Elena encountered the conversation that would cost everything. Approaching the main counter, voices from the back office reached her ears. Stone walls created acoustic chambers that carried sound farther than speakers intended. "The Morrison property papers are ready," said Jeremiah Parker, the bank's head clerk. 47 documents total, backdated to establish prior ownership. A deeper voice responded with commanding authority. Silas Crowfield himself, speaking with casual confidence of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. "Excellent work, Parker. The Sterling Ranch deed proves especially valuable. 2,400 acres of prime grazing, officially purchased from John Miller in January 1883 for $1,200. Complete with witness signatures and territorial seal." Elena's blood turned to ice. John Miller never existed. Sterling Ranch was never sold. Crowfield described a legal weapon aimed at her family's legacy. "What about the Morrison place?" Parker continued. "Small matter. Daniel Morrison's practice depends on territorial appointments I control. Once he understands the situation, cooperation becomes more profitable than resistance." Elena's mind raced through implications. If Crowfield possessed forged documents establishing Sterling Ranch ownership, territorial courts might recognize his claim. Local corruption was an open secret, and Crowfield's wealth could purchase whatever legal opinions he required. Her father had spent 18 years legally building Sterling Ranch from nothing. Every acre was properly purchased, surveyed, recorded with the Territorial Land Office. But if competing documentation existed, if judges could be convinced prior ownership was established, everything Jacob Sterling worked for could be stolen with ink on paper. Elena completed her transaction and departed, cold air striking like physical blows. Standing in snow outside First National Bank, she faced a choice defining not only her fate, but everyone she loved's destiny. She could return to Sterling Ranch, share what she'd overheard, trust legal channels would provide adequate protection against Crowfield's scheme. Or she could gather evidence, document the conspiracy, build a case strong enough to survive territorial court corruption. Elena Sterling Morrison had inherited her father's courage and mother's intelligence. The choice required no deliberation. The following evening, after Daniel had fallen asleep, Elena returned to Frostwood Creek under cover of darkness. The intensified storm provided perfect concealment for activities that couldn't bear daylight exposure. She approached the bank from rear, using childhood hide-and-seek skills that had prepared her for purposes no one could have imagined. The bank's delivery entrance yielded to a hairpin technique her father taught during seemingly playful self-reliance lessons. Inside the darkened building, Elena moved with careful silence. Understanding discovery meant death. Crowfield's office contained a massive safe steel door slightly ajar in testament to his confidence that no one would dare challenge his authority. Inside, Elena discovered documentation exceeding her worst fears. The comprehensive documentation revealed the conspiracy's massive scope, financial records detailing bribes to judges, sheriffs, territorial officials, railroad executives. A comprehensive conspiracy extending beyond simple theft into systematic corruption threatening law's foundation. Among documents, Elena found correspondence revealing Crowfield's true ambitions. Denver and Rio Grande Railroad required 47,000 acres for a mountain route connecting Colorado's mining regions with eastern markets. Rather than negotiate fair purchases, the railroad contracted Crowfield to acquire property through legal manipulation and intimidation. Financial details were staggering. Legitimate purchase would cost $340,000. Crowfield's illegal acquisition reduced costs to under $80,000, with savings split between railroad and his criminal organization. Elena photographed every document using Daniel's camera for legal evidence. The work required 3 hours, hands trembling not from cold but growing understanding of how completely Crowfield had corrupted territorial government. Preparing to leave, footsteps echoed from the building's front. Elena extinguished her lamp, pressed against the wall behind Crowfield's desk, heart hammering like a caged bird. Footsteps approached slowly, deliberately, as if their owner had unlimited time and no fear of discovery. Silas Crowfield entered carrying a kerosene lamp casting dancing shadows. At 40, he possessed predatory handsomeness, serving him well in business and politics. His expensive suit fit lean frames with purchased precision. Everything spoke of success, sophistication, absolute certainty from never encountering obstacles that sufficient wealth and violence couldn't overcome. He moved directly to the safe, apparently retrieving something from its contents. Paper rustling filled silence as he sorted documents, occasionally muttering comments revealing current operations. Morrison property? Yes. Sterling Ranch? Perfect. Judge Henderson's retainer? Due immediately. Elena remained motionless, barely breathing, as Crowfield completed business and prepared leaving. She'd almost convinced herself escape was possible when the camera's leather strap, loosened by careful manipulation, slipped from her shoulder. The camera striking wooden floor echoed through the building like gunshots. Crowfield spun toward noise, hand moving instantly to the revolver beneath his coat. Well, well, his voice carried satisfied tones of cats cornering interesting mice. Miss Elena Sterling Morrison, if I'm not mistaken, conducting irregular banking business. Elena rose slowly from behind the desk, camera clutched like a shield against what was coming. Mr. Crowfield, I was just stealing proprietary documents from my private safe. Yes, I can see that. He stepped closer, lamp casting diabolic relief while his right hand remained poised above his weapon. The question that interests me, Miss Morrison, is what you intend doing with gathered information. I intend exposing your crimes to proper authorities. Crowfield's laugh held all warmth of January wind across frozen lakes. Proper authorities? You mean Judge Henderson, who owes his appointment to my influence? Sheriff Parker, whose salary I supplement? Perhaps the territorial governor, who depends on railroad contributions for political aspirations? Truth struck Elena like physical blows. Corruption extended beyond local officials. Crowfield hadn't simply bribed individuals. He'd purchased an entire system. My husband will take evidence to Denver, to federal authorities who can't be bought. Your husband practices law at territorial court's pleasure, which I control. His income depends on appointments I can withdraw with single telegrams. Daniel Morrison is intelligent, Miss Elena. He'll understand cooperation serves his interests better than opposition. Elena lifted her chin with stubborn, sterling courage. You underestimate both my husband and father. They'll never allow you to steal our land. Steal? Crowfield's voice carried genuine puzzlement. My dear woman, I'm not stealing anything. I'm correcting historical oversights in property documentation. Your father's claim depends on territorial records that prove incomplete and legally questionable. He gestured towards scattered documents. I possess properly executed deeds establishing prior Sterling Ranch ownership by John Miller, from whom I purchased the property in January 1883 for $1,200. Completely legal, properly witnessed, officially recorded. John Miller never existed. Those documents are forgeries. Can you prove that? In courts before judges weighing competing claims based on available evidence? Crowfield's smile widened. Legal proof requires more than accusations, Miss Morrison. Elena understood with crystal clarity that rational discussion had ended. Crowfield possessed power to corrupt any legal proceeding, purchase any required verdict. Law had become merely another tool for men recognizing no authority beyond their own will to power. Then we'll find another way, she said quietly. No, Crowfield replied with judicial finality. I'm afraid you won't. The office door opened behind Elena, announcing Reynolds and Carter's arrival. Crowfield purchased their loyalty with generous wages and promises their particular skills would always be in demand. Reynolds, 34 and lean as whips, had drifted west from Kansas after careers including cattle rustling, bank robbery, and 3 proven murders. Carter possessed the kind of brutality civilization hadn't managed polishing away. Gentlemen, Crowfield said without taking eyes from Elena's face, We have a small problem requiring immediate solution. What followed was swift and terrible. Elena fought with desperate courage, managing to scratch Reynolds and kick Carter hard enough to double him over. But outcomes were never in doubt. When consciousness finally left her, she was grateful for darkness's mercy. December 21st dawned cold and clear, making mountains seem touchable. Jacob Sterling stood on his porch, coffee steaming, watching the road connecting Sterling Ranch to Frostwood Creek. Elena and Daniel had left the previous evening for Judge Henderson's social gathering, promising midnight return. Their failure to appear had cost Jacob sleep and left him with restless anxiety 18 years of frontier life taught him to take seriously. By noon, when no word came from town, Jacob saddled his best horse and rode toward Frostwood Creek through snow, drifted across roads in places deep enough to challenge experienced riders. Surrounding silence felt ominous, as if land itself held breath anticipating terrible revelation. He found them in Red Canyon, 3 miles from town on the road winding through foothills toward Sterling Ranch. The scene was carefully arranged, suggesting tragic accident. Daniel Morrison's body lay crumpled beside an overturned wagon. Elena's form, partially buried in snow, accumulated against canyon walls. Jacob dismounted and approached bodies with careful attention to detail that had served him well during 15 sheriff years. What he saw confirmed worse suspicions. The wagon was deliberately overturned, horses driven away, removing witnesses. Daniel's skull showed blunt force trauma rather than riding accident injuries. Elena's body bore no marks visible to casual observers, but Jacob's experienced eye detected violent signs no accident could explain. In Elena's frozen hand, he discovered paper that somehow survived the storm. The message, written in his daughter's careful script, but marred by what appeared to be blood, consisted of only a few words. 7 days. Justice will come to Sterling Ranch. Crowfield killed us. Proof in bank safe. Avenge. Jacob Sterling knelt in snow beside his daughter's body as absolute loss crashed down like avalanches. Margaret, taken by disease. Elena, murdered by greed. In 5 years, everything giving his life meaning beyond daily survival struggle had been torn away by forces beyond his control. But this time, the force had name and face. Silas Crowfield. Standing slowly, Jacob folded the blood-stained note and placed it in his coat pocket. When he spoke, his voice carried across empty canyon with oath-sworn authority. 7 days, he said to wind, snow, and distant mountains. In 7 days, Silas Crowfield will answer for what he's done. The man who rode toward Sterling Ranch bore little resemblance to the grieving father who discovered his daughter's body. Something fundamental had changed in Jacob Sterling during those canyon moments. Some final connection between civilized man and savage frontier had been severed forever. Justice wasn't something received from courts and judges. Justice was something taken with your own hands when law failed and civilization proved itself comfortable lies. Catherine Whitmore stood at her boarding house window on Elm Street, watching Jacob Sterling's solitary figure disappear into gathering dusk. At 29, Kate possessed understated beauty, serving her well in communities where excessive attention could prove dangerous to women living alone. Her auburn hair caught lamplight as she moved to the small desk where she conducted business correspondence, maintaining her carefully constructed identity. Kate's tailoring and boarding house occupied a modest 2-story building she'd purchased with cash 8 months earlier, claiming to be a St. Louis merchant's widow killed in railway accidents. 12 rooms rented to traveling salesmen provided both income and excellent intelligence about economic and political activities shaping Frostwood Creek life. But Catherine Whitmore was not who she appeared to be. Her real name was Victoria Hammond, widow of Federal Circuit Judge Harold Hammond, who died not from natural causes, but from poison Silas Crowfield administered during what should have been routine Denver business meetings. Harold Hammond hadn't been the corrupt judge public records suggested. For 2 years prior to death, he'd worked as undercover federal marshal, investigating conspiracies stretching across 7 territories involving systematic land theft, territorial government corruption, and railroad expansion policy manipulation, benefiting criminal entrepreneurs. At this conspiracy's center stood Silas Crowfield. Harold's investigation revealed operations dwarfing anything federal authorities had previously encountered in Western territories. Railroad companies, rather than negotiating fair land purchases, entered agreements with criminal organizations that would acquire necessary acreage through fraud, intimidation, and violence. Cost savings were enormous, profits spectacular, human costs invisible to investors never seeing displaced families' faces. When Harold prepared presenting evidence to federal district court in March 1882, Crowfield arranged his assassination with casual efficiency applied to other business obstacles. Poison administered in Harold's coffee during meetings arranged to discuss territorial judicial appointments killed him within hours. Death was ruled natural causes, investigation perfunctory, case closed before questions could be asked. Victoria barely escaped similar fate. Harold's final telegram, sent hours before the meeting that would kill him, warned her to disappear immediately and trust no one in official positions. She'd faked her death, assumed Catherine Whitmore identity, using documents Harold prepared for emergencies, and spent 18 months following money trails leading inevitably to Frostwood Creek. Her mission was both personal and official. As Victoria Hammond, she sought vengeance for her husband's murder. As Catherine Whitmore, she gathered evidence to complete Harold's investigation and bring federal justice to conspiracies operating with impunity too long. Hidden beneath her quarters floorboards, Kate maintained an arsenal, surprising anyone thinking of her as merely refined seamstresses seeking quiet frontier lives. Winchester Model 1873 rifle, Colt single-action Army revolver, Smith & Wesson 38 caliber pistol, sufficient ammunition for small wars, $2,400 cash, and complete federal marshal credentials establishing her authority to make arrests and conduct investigations throughout Colorado territory. On December 21st night, as news of Elena and Daniel Morrison's deaths spread through Frostwood Creek with tragedy's typical speed in small communities, Kate understood the action moment had arrived. Jacob Sterling wasn't a man accepting his daughter's murder in passive silence. His reputation, earned through 15 honest law enforcement years, suggested he possessed both courage and competence to pose serious threats to Crowfield's operations. More importantly, his grief would make him receptive to alliances with others, sharing his justice desires. Time had come to reveal herself to the one man in Frostwood Creek who might possess strength and determination necessary to see fights through to conclusions. December 22nd found Jacob Sterling alone in Spring Valley Cemetery, kneeling beside Elena's fresh grave in knee-deep snow. Temperature had dropped to 8 below zero, with wind cutting through heaviest clothing like blades seeking bone, but Jacob seemed oblivious to physical discomfort. He'd been there 3 hours, wrestling with grief and rage threatening to consume his remaining sanity. The headstone, carved with simple precision by Henry McCann's skilled hands, bore only essential facts. Elena Sterling Morrison, beloved daughter and wife, taken too soon by worlds proving themselves unworthy of her goodness. Footsteps approaching through snow brought Jacob's hand instinctively to the Colt 45 at his hip, then relaxed as a feminine figure emerged from darkness, carrying a kerosene lantern, casting flickering shadows across surrounding headstones. "Mr. Sterling," Kate's voice carried clearly through wind, steady despite brutal cold. "Mrs. Whitmore, dangerous night for cemetery visits." Kate set the lantern on a nearby marker, light creating small warmth circles in vast surrounding darkness. "I need to speak with you about Elena's death." Jacob rose slowly from beside his daughter's grave, every muscle tense with alertness that had kept him alive through 15 frontier law enforcement years. "What about it?" "She wasn't killed in riding accidents." Words hung in frozen air between them like accusations demanding responses. "You know something." Jacob's statement carried no questions, only flat certainty from men who'd learned reading truth in human voices. Kate withdrew a leather portfolio from beneath her coat, movements careful and deliberate in lamplight. 73 letters between Silas Crowfield and my late husband. Harold didn't die from natural causes, Mr. Sterling. Crowfield poisoned him in Denver on March 15, 1882. Jacob examined documents by lantern light, experienced eyes taking in handwriting analysis, financial records, correspondence revealing multi-territorial conspiracies. Evidence was comprehensive, damning, absolutely convincing to anyone with expertise understanding its implications. Harold discovered Crowfield's master plan, Kate continued, her voice growing stronger as she revealed information guarded for 18 months. Denver and Rio Grande Railroad needs 47,000 acres for new lines through mountain passes. Instead of legitimate purchases, they contracted Crowfield to acquire land illegally at market value fractions. Total cost savings exceed $300,000. And you are? Jacob asked, though something in Kate's manner had already suggested answers to unthought questions. Kate met his gaze directly, lamplight revealing eyes holding knowledge and determination depths belonging to someone far more than frontier seamstresses. Victoria Hammond, Deputy United States Marshal, commissioned by Federal District Court of Colorado Territory. Harold was my husband and partner. I've spent 18 months building cases against Crowfield. Why approach me now? Because Elena found evidence Harold died protecting. And because you're the only man in Frostwood Creek with courage to see this through to ends. Jacob studied Kate's face in flickering lantern light, reading truth in features carefully schooled to reveal nothing of intelligence and determination lying beneath. What do you propose? Legal prosecution could take years, assuming we could find judges and prosecutors Crowfield's organization hasn't purchased. Federal marshals are spread thin across territories, and Crowfield owns enough officials to delay investigations indefinitely. Kate's voice carried frustration from someone who'd spent months learning the true corruption scope they faced. By time we could build formal cases, Crowfield will have disappeared with stolen money. Jacob stared into darkness beyond their small light circle, jaw set with determination that had built Sterling Ranch from wilderness and made him one of 3 counties' most respected men. Then we make our own justice. What do you have in mind? Jacob turned back to Kate, eyes reflecting lantern flames like winter ice chips. 7 days, 1 week to dismantle his empire piece by piece, just like he's been dismantling honest people's lives for years. Over the next hour, as wind howled around them and temperature continued dropping, Jacob and Kate developed systematic plans that would destroy Crowfield's operations through carefully calculated strikes against his power and wealth sources. Day 1 would target Crowfield's pride, thunderbolt theft and other prize horses, animals representing substantial financial value and personal prestige, men like Crowfield valued above mere money. Day 2 would create panic by contaminating town water supply, demonstrating Crowfield couldn't protect even basic community needs he claimed controlling. Day 3 would wage psychological warfare through paintings depicting Crowfield's crimes in vivid detail, attacking his peace of mind and forcing confrontation with visual guilt evidence. Day 4 would expose his crimes to 847 Frostwood Creek residents, destroying respectability reputations that allowed impunity operations. Day 5 would eliminate business assets, removing financial resources, funding criminal operations. Day 6 would remove political protection, isolating him from corrupt officials enabling his crimes. Day 7 would bring final justice, either through legal prosecution or more direct means. As they finalized plans, approaching hoofbeats echoed across the cemetery. Both Jacob and Kate reached for weapons, then relaxed as familiar figures emerged from darkness. Deputy Marcus Reed dismounted and approached their position with cautious movements, from men understanding unexpected encounters could turn deadly without warning. At 31, Marcus had served as deputy sheriff for 6 years, earning competence and integrity reputations, placing him among few territorial law enforcement officers Crowfield's money couldn't purchase. Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Whitmore. Marcus removed his hat despite bitter cold, melted snow droplets glistening in his dark hair. Unusual time for cemetery meetings. Jacob and Kate exchanged glances, each understanding their alliance had reached decision moments. They could attempt concealing plans from lawmen whose honesty was well established, but whose loyalty remained unknown, or risk trusting someone whose position might prove crucial to their success. Deputy Reed, Jacob said carefully, we were discussing Elena's death's tragic circumstances. Marcus studied both with intelligent, brown eyes, missing very little. Mr. Sterling, I've been a lawman long enough recognizing when people plan something beyond discussion, and I've been in Frostwood Creek long enough knowing your daughter's death wasn't any riding accident result. Kate leaned forward, voice carrying authority from someone accustomed to command. What makes you say that, Deputy? Because I've seen too many crime scenes, Mrs. Whitmore. I know what violence looks like, and I know accident appearances. What I found in Red Canyon yesterday was violence, pure and simple. Jacob made his decision with speed, characterizing every important adult life choice. Then maybe you'd like hearing what we know about who's responsible. Over 30 minutes, Jacob and Kate shared evidence they'd gathered, watching Marcus Reed's face grow progressively grimmer as Crowfield's criminal enterprise scope became clear. When they finished, the deputy sat silently for several minutes, processing information confirming suspicions he'd harbored for months. My father was Thomas Reed, Marcus said quietly. He owned Reed Ranch until 1878, when Silas Crowfield acquired it through foreclosures seeming legitimate at the time. My father died 6 months later, supposedly from heart attacks, but he was only 42 and never showed heart trouble signs. You think Crowfield killed him? Kate asked. I know Crowfield killed him, Mrs. Whitmore. The question is whether I'm willing risking my badge and life to prove it. Marcus stood and walked to their small light circle's edge, staring into surrounding darkness. When he turned back, his face showed resolve from men who'd wrestled with conscience and emerged with clear purpose. Count me in, he said simply. My father died unavenged too long. Jacob reached into his coat pocket and withdrew it Elena's blood-stained note, unfolding it carefully in lantern light. 7 days, he read aloud, voice carrying across frozen cemetery with oath-sworn authority. Justice will come to Sterling Ranch. He folded paper again and met his two allies' eyes. 7 days it is. As three conspirators prepared leaving the cemetery, none noticed the figure watching from behind distant headstones. Reynolds, Crowfield's chief enforcer, had followed Deputy Reed from town after observing the lawmen's unusual behavior following Morrison Body's discovery. Reynolds smiled watching three figures disappear into darkness, already planning how he'd report this information to his employer. Crowfield would be very interested learning Jacob Sterling had found allies, and very generous, rewarding men providing advance warning of whatever they might be planning. Cold War between Crowfield's criminal organization and Jacob Sterling's Justice Alliance was about to turn hot, and Reynolds looked forward to violence that would inevitably follow. As Jacob Sterling rode toward his ranch through relentlessly persistent snow, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death 5 years earlier. Purpose, direction, clean, simple clarity from knowing exactly what needed doing and possessing both will and means to accomplish it. Silas Crowfield had made two critical mistakes. First, he'd murdered Elena Sterling Morrison, thereby creating enemies who would never stop, never compromise, never forget. Second, he'd assumed local institution corruption would sufficiently protect him from his crime's consequences. Both mistakes would prove fatal. 7 days, 1 week to bring justice to men who'd placed themselves beyond law's reach, but not beyond determination, courage, and righteous fury's reach. The war for Frostwood Creek's soul was about to begin. December 24th, 4 o'clock in the morning. Temperature minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, wind howling at 45 miles per hour, visibility reduced to 30 feet in blizzard conditions that would have sent lesser men seeking shelter. But Jacob Sterling, Kate Whitmore, and Marcus Reed were not lesser men. They were warriors preparing for battle against an enemy who had declared war on justice itself. They approached Crowfield's livery stable complex from 3 directions, using the storm as cover that no human eyes could penetrate. The snow fell with such biblical intensity that their tracks disappeared within minutes, and the wind carried away any sound their movements might have made. This was God's own weather for conducting the kind of business that decent men were sometimes forced to undertake. As they approached the familiar stable complex, Jacob remembered every detail from their previous reconnaissance. The imposing structure still housed Crowfield's prized animals, but now it was guarded with doubled security. These animals were symbols of status, living proof that Silas Crowfield had risen above the common struggles of frontier life to achieve something approaching aristocracy in a land that had never known kings. Thunderbolt occupied the corner stall like a monarch holding court. The magnificent black stallion stood 16 hands high, muscles rippling beneath his winter coat with every movement, nostrils flaring with the kind of spirited intelligence that made him worth $800. In a territory where skilled workers earned $25 per month, Thunderbolt represented more wealth than most families would accumulate in 3 hard years of honest labor. The stable's security reflected Crowfield's understanding of human nature and frontier economics. 4 guards rotated in 12-hour shifts, each man earning more in a week than most cowboys saw in a month. But even well-paid loyalty had its limits when faced with weather that could kill a man in minutes. The blizzard had forced all but one sentry into the heated guardhouse, where they huddled around a pot-bellied stove, playing cards and drinking whiskey to ward off the cold that penetrated even the thickest walls. Jacob approached from the north, using the barn's wind shadow to mask his movements, while his experienced eyes cataloged every detail of the defensive arrangements. 22 years of law enforcement had taught him patience, timing, and the kind of careful observation that separated living lawmen from dead heroes. He carried his Winchester Model 1873, the rifle that had never missed when his life depended on accuracy, the Colt's single-action army that had cleared leather faster than his enemies could blink, a hunting knife honed to razor sharpness, and enough rope to control 7 horses if the opportunity presented itself. Kate positioned herself at the stable's rear exit, her feminine appearance concealed beneath men's clothing and a heavy coat that disguised her true form. Her federal marshal training was evident in the confident way she handled her Smith & Wesson .38, checking the cylinder one final time before settling into position among the shadows. Her role was crucial: prevent any guards from escaping, to raise an alarm that would bring Crowfield's entire organization down upon them like wolves descending on wounded prey. Marcus Reed took the eastern approach, covering the main entrance with the natural authority of a lawman whose presence in any location could be easily explained to anyone who might question his activities. As deputy sheriff, he possessed legitimate reasons for patrolling during severe weather, checking on the welfare of citizens and livestock that represented the economic foundation of their small community. His intimate knowledge of guard rotations and building layout would prove invaluable if unexpected complications arose during their carefully planned operation. Jacob reached the stable without detection, moving through the storm like a ghost that left no traces in its wake. The interior warmth hit him like a physical blow after the brutal cold outside, and he paused for a moment to let his eyes adjust to the dim light cast by oil lamps hanging from wooden rafters. The familiar smells of hay, leather, and horse sweat filled his nostrils, bringing back memories of his own cavalry service during the war between the states. 23 horses stamped and whinnied softly, agitated by the storm, but somehow calmed by Jacob's presence. Animals possessed instincts that men had largely forgotten, an ability to sense character and intention that transcended human deception. These horses recognized Jacob as someone who understood their nature, who would treat them with the respect that living creatures deserve. He worked with the systematic efficiency of a man who had handled horses since childhood, when his father had taught him that a man's relationship with his animals revealed everything about his character. First, he cut the telegraph wire connecting the stable to Crowfield's mansion, ensuring that no alarm could be transmitted to summon reinforcements. The copper wire parted with a soft snap that was immediately swallowed by the wind howling through gaps in the wooden walls. Second, he applied his horseman's knowledge to quietly saddle Thunderbolt and 6 other valuable animals, working in the darkness between oil lamps, where shadows provided natural concealment. Each saddle was fitted with the care of a man who understood that poorly secured tack could mean death in mountain terrain. Every buckle was checked, every strap tested, every piece of equipment examined for flaws that might prove fatal. Third, he opened every remaining stall door, creating controlled chaos that would cover their escape route and confuse any pursuit that might follow. 17 horses would scatter across the countryside, some heading for familiar pastures, others seeking shelter from the storm. Finding and recovering them would occupy Crowfield's men for days, preventing them from organizing effective pursuit of the stolen prize animals. The plan unfolded with military precision that reflected Jacob's Civil War experience, until an unexpected complication threatened to transform careful strategy into desperate improvisation. The guard rotation occurred 15 minutes ahead of schedule, possibly due to concern about the worsening weather conditions. The sentry discovered the open stalls and raised an alarm that echoed through the building like the trumpet blast announcing Judgment Day. Within seconds, the peaceful stable erupted into chaos as boots pounded across wooden floors and men's voices shouted orders that revealed both surprise and professional anger. Crowfield's guards might be criminals, but they were competent criminals who understood their employer's expectations regarding the protection of valuable property. Reynolds emerged from the guardhouse first, his lean frame moving with predatory grace as he fired his Remington 44 into the swirling snow, where muzzle flashes had revealed movement. At 34 years old, Reynolds had earned his reputation through violence applied with surgical precision, and his presence on Crowfield's payroll represented a significant investment in intimidation and enforcement capabilities. Carter flanked him from the east, Winchester rifle spitting flame as he attempted to locate targets in blizzard conditions that turned friend and foe into identical shadows. The younger man lacked Reynolds' experience, but compensated with raw aggression and a willingness to kill that made him valuable for certain types of work that required more brutality than finesse. Marcus Reed returned fire immediately, maintaining his deputy sheriff cover, while providing the distraction Jacob needed to lead 7 stolen horses away from the stable through the rear exit where Kate waited to provide additional protection. The sound of gunfire echoed off canyon walls, creating acoustic confusion that made it impossible to determine the number of shooters or their exact positions. The chase that followed tested every skill Jacob had acquired during his years on the frontier, when survival depended on reading terrain, weather, and the intentions of both men and animals. Leading 7 horses through narrow canyon passes in near-zero visibility required instincts honed by decades of mountain experience that no amount of formal education could provide. The stolen animals fought against unfamiliar riders in strange terrain, their natural herding instincts complicated by the storm that made every shadow potentially dangerous. Thunderbolt, despite his value in training, was still a creature of flesh and blood that could be spooked by unexpected sounds or movements. Managing him while controlling 6 other horses required the kind of multitasking that separated competent horsemen from those who ended up dead in box canyons. Horse hooves slipped on ice that could cripple animals and riders alike, sending them tumbling into ravines where broken bones meant death from exposure, even if the fall itself didn't prove fatal. The wind howled with such supernatural fury that it became impossible to determine the direction of gunshots until muzzle flashes provided momentary illumination against the white void that surrounded them. But Jacob knew these mountains like other men knew the rooms of their homes, every trail and shelter and dangerous passage mapped in his memory, through years of tracking fugitives and hunting game that fed his family during lean seasons. He led the stolen horses through terrain that would challenge experienced riders in perfect daylight, using knowledge that no amount of Crowfield's money could purchase from Denver mercenaries. The pursuit continued for more than 2 hours before Crowfield's men were forced to abandon the chase. Their horses, unaccustomed to mountain conditions and winter weather, could not match the endurance of animals bred for frontier life. The storm provided perfect concealment, and Jacob's intimate knowledge of the terrain created advantages that professional gunmen could not overcome through superior firepower alone. When the stolen horses were finally secured in a box canyon 8 miles from town, where natural windbreaks and spring-fed water would keep them alive until the weather cleared, Jacob allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The first day of his 7-day promise had been fulfilled with precision that would have impressed his old cavalry commanders. Crowfield's pride had been wounded, his sense of invincibility challenged, and his criminal organization put on notice that they faced an enemy who could strike at will and disappear like smoke. But the discovery Kate made during the confusion of the raid would prove more valuable than 7 stolen horses worth several $1,000s. While Jacob led the animals to safety through terrain that tested both his horsemanship and his knowledge of mountain survival, Kate had used the chaos surrounding the gun battle to conduct a search of the stable's administrative office. Hidden beneath loose floorboards that had been carefully concealed, but not carefully enough to fool someone with federal law enforcement training, she found Charles Whitmore's personal effects. The leather satchel contained $2,100 in cash, more money than most frontier families would see in 5 years of honest labor. A business ledger recorded 156 fraudulent transactions with meticulous detail that revealed the methodical nature of Crowfield's criminal enterprise. Personal correspondence proved beyond any doubt that Crowfield had murdered Charles Whitmore in Frostwood Creek on March 15, 1883, not in St. Louis as Kate had believed for 18 months. Railroad survey maps showed the exact acreage needed for Denver and Rio Grande expansion, with handwritten notations indicating which properties had been successfully acquired through fraud and which remained to be targeted. The maps reveal that Crowfield's conspiracy extended far beyond Frostwood Creek to encompass a territory-wide operation involving dozens of communities and thousands of acres of prime real estate. This evidence proved that Kate's investigation had been focused on the right target, but it also revealed that the conspiracy was larger and more sophisticated than either she or her murdered husband had originally suspected. Charles Whitmore had been killed not for discovering a local land fraud scheme, but for stumbling upon a criminal enterprise that threatened to corrupt the entire process of Western development. The satchel also contained something else that would prove significant in ways Kate couldn't yet imagine: a photograph of a young woman she didn't recognize, with an inscription on the back reading, "To my beloved Charles, until we meet again, Elizabeth." Elizabeth, a name that would soon become central to their fight against Crowfield's organization. Christmas morning brought bitter irony to Frostwood Creek as Jacob Sterling prepared to wage psychological warfare against the man who had murdered his daughter on the day Christians celebrated the birth of the Prince of Peace. The contradiction was not lost on him, but righteousness sometimes required methods that gentle souls could not understand or approve. The town's main well represented more than a source of water for 847 residents. During winter months when the creek froze solid, this hand pump system reaching 47 feet down to the natural water table meant the difference between life and death for the entire community. Control of the water supply equaled control of the population, a principle that Silas Crowfield understood perfectly and had used to maintain his economic stranglehold on the region. Jacob's engineering knowledge, gained through years of ranch construction and the kind of practical problem-solving that frontier life demanded, proved crucial for executing the second day's operation. He created a water contamination system using 5 pounds of iron oxide, commonly known as red rust, mixed with 3 gallons of water to produce a slurry that would turn the entire well output the color of fresh blood. The execution required precise timing and careful attention to technical details that could mean the difference between success and discovery. Jacob descended into the well using rope and pulley equipment that he had constructed according to mining techniques learned during his younger years in Colorado's goldfields. The confined space, barely wide enough to accommodate a man's shoulders, tested his nerves as much as his physical capabilities. Working by the light of a carefully shielded lantern, Jacob deployed the mixture at optimal depth to ensure complete distribution throughout the water table without creating concentrations that might quickly settle out of the solution. The timing mechanism, constructed from a weighted bucket and carefully measured rope, would release the iron oxide slurry at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning when the first residents would draw water for their daily needs. The results exceeded his most optimistic expectations. As dawn broke across Frostwood Creek on Christmas morning, families throughout the community discovered crimson liquid flowing from their pumps instead of the clear, cold water they depended upon for survival. The effect on a deeply religious community celebrating Christ's birthday was profound and deeply unsettling. Mrs. Abigail Green, the minister's wife, screamed when she saw blood-red water filling her bucket outside the parsonage. Within minutes, her cry was taken up by other women throughout the town as the contamination spread through the entire water distribution system. Children ran crying to their parents, convinced that the world was ending in supernatural judgment. Men gathered in angry groups on street corners, demanding explanations that no one could provide. Elderly residents crossed themselves while muttering prayers for divine protection, remembering biblical plagues that had turned rivers to blood as punishment for sin. Some interpreted the phenomenon as divine judgment against unspecified wickedness within their community, beginning to examine their own conscience for transgressions that might have brought such wrath upon them. Others blamed natural causes, suggesting that underground mineral deposits or seismic disturbances had affected the water table in ways that scientific knowledge could not yet explain. Mining operations in the surrounding mountains had been known to alter groundwater chemistry, and Colorado's geological instability was well documented. But 156 residents began connecting the bloody water to the previous day's horse theft, questioning whether Silas Crowfield's authority was as absolute as he had always claimed. If he couldn't protect his own property or guarantee the safety of the town's most basic necessity, what other failures might follow? What other aspects of his carefully constructed empire might prove vulnerable to determined opposition? Crowfield's response revealed both his desperation and his fundamental misunderstanding of the psychological warfare being waged against him. Rather than investigating the contamination's cause or working to restore clean water to his community, he immediately increased security from 4 to 12 armed guards, posting them at strategic locations throughout Frostwood Creek with orders to shoot anyone acting suspiciously. He offered a $500 bounty for Jacob Sterling's capture, dead or alive, and sent urgent telegraph messages to Denver, requesting professional trackers who specialized in hunting fugitives through mountain terrain. Most significantly, he began investigating Kate Whitmore's background through territorial and federal law enforcement contacts, suspecting that Jacob Sterling had found allies whose capabilities extended far beyond local knowledge and frontier skills. The psychological impact of the bloody water would last for days, creating an atmosphere of unease and uncertainty that undermined Crowfield's carefully cultivated image of control and competence. Residents who had never questioned his authority began whispering doubts about his ability to protect them from threats both natural and supernatural. But on Christmas afternoon, as the contamination reached its peak psychological effect, and families throughout Frostwood Creek struggled to find clean water for cooking their holiday meals, an unexpected visitor arrived at Sterling Ranch who would transform the entire nature of their conflict with Crowfield's organization. Billy Morrison appeared at Jacob's front porch like a small ghost materialized from the swirling snow that continued to fall with relentless persistence. At 8 years old, he was Elena's cousin's son, whose father had died in a mining accident 2 years earlier. Daniel Morrison had taken him and his family when a tunnel collapse trapped 12 men beneath tons of Colorado granite. Billy had been staying with Elena and Daniel during their Christmas visit, sleeping in the guest room of their modest house when Crowfield's assassins came to commit the murders that were intended to silence forever anyone who might threaten the criminal empire that had made Silas Crowfield the most powerful man in 3 counties. The boy collapsed on the porch steps in the final stages of hypothermia, his small body pushed beyond the limits of human endurance by walking 12 miles through blizzard conditions that would have killed grown men within hours. His lips were blue with cyanosis, his fingers white with frostbite that threatened permanent damage, and his entire body shook with convulsions that spoke of prolonged exposure to cold that could stop a human heart. Kate's medical knowledge, learned from frontier necessity rather than formal training, but comprehensive enough to handle most emergencies that arose in isolated communities, guided the treatment that would save Billy's life. Gradual warming in the main house prevented the shock that could kill hypothermia victims. Hot broth administered in careful doses restored body heat without overwhelming his stress system. Dry clothing eliminated the wet garments that continued stealing precious warmth, and the kind of patient care that seemed to come naturally to women provided comfort that was as important as any medical intervention. Billy remained silent for nearly 3 hours after his rescue, his young mind struggling to process horrors that no child should ever witness. When he finally spoke, his words were barely above whispers, but they confirmed Jacob's worst suspicions and revealed details that would reshape their understanding of Crowfield's criminal methods and future intentions. The boy had been hiding in the cellar storage room of his uncle's house when the killers arrived just after midnight on December 21st. Through gaps between the floorboards above his hiding place, he had watched Reynolds and Carter methodically murder both Elena and Daniel Morrison, search the house systematically for documents they couldn't locate, and arrange the bodies with professional skill to simulate the riding accident that would deceive most investigators. Billy had escaped through a narrow cellar window that adults couldn't have navigated, retrieved a critical item from his father's secret hiding place that even the killers hadn't discovered, and walked through the storm to reach the only person he trusted to protect him from the men who had destroyed his family with such casual brutality. The item he carried would prove invaluable to their cause and provide connections they had never suspected. Daniel Morrison's Waltham pocket watch, crafted from 14-karat gold and worth $45 in a territory where such luxury items were rarely seen, bore an engraving that provided crucial intelligence about relationships extending far beyond Frostwood Creek. To Daniel, justice above all, Judge Hammond, 1881. Judge Hammond, Harold Hammond, Kate's murdered husband. The connection between Daniel Morrison and Harold Hammond suggested a relationship that extended far beyond coincidence or casual acquaintance. Daniel had been more than simply Elena's husband who happened to practice law in Denver. He had been an active participant in Harold's investigation into Crowfield's criminal network, possibly serving as a local intelligence source who could observe activities that federal marshals couldn't monitor from distant offices. This revelation meant that Elena's murder had been motivated by more than her accidental discovery of forged documents in Crowfield's bank safe. She had been killed because her husband was part of a federal investigation that threatened to expose the entire conspiracy. Crowfield's organization had eliminated both Daniel and Elena to protect secrets that extended across multiple territories and involved criminal activities worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the watch contained something even more valuable than evidence of past alliances between federal investigators and local allies. Hidden behind its gold face, accessible only through careful manipulation of the mechanism, Billy had discovered a hand-drawn map showing the location of a secret cache where Daniel had stored complete documentation of Crowfield's crimes. The map led to Devil's Canyon Cave System, located 2.3 miles northeast of Frostwood Creek, in terrain that few people ever visited due to its remoteness and the dangerous approaches that could trap unwary travelers during severe weather. Billy had memorized the route during summer camping trips with his uncle, never imagining that childhood adventures would someday provide crucial knowledge for bringing justice to his murdered family. Billy also revealed information that added an entirely new dimension to their conflict with Crowfield's organization. The criminal leader kept a woman imprisoned in his mansion's basement, locked away from the world in conditions that suggested prolonged captivity and systematic abuse. She screamed sometimes at night. The boy reported with the matter-of-fact delivery that children used when describing nightmares that had become routine. Daniel Morrison had tried to help this mysterious prisoner, Billy explained, but couldn't get close enough to Crowfield's heavily guarded residence to attempt any rescue operation. The woman's identity remained unknown, but her existence suggested that Crowfield's crimes extended beyond murder and fraud into kidnapping and torture. This revelation transformed their mission from simple justice for Elena's murder into something larger and more urgent. An innocent woman suffered in Crowfield's basement while they planned their methodical destruction of his criminal empire. Her rescue would become an additional objective that could not be delayed indefinitely while they pursued their original 7-day timeline. December 26 dawned clear and bitterly cold as Jacob employed the artistic skills he had acquired during his brief time at Massachusetts College of Art to wage psychological warfare against Silas Crowfield's peace of mind. The irony was not lost on him that talents originally intended to create beauty would now serve such dark purposes. During his student years in the 1850s, before the Civil War interrupted his education and transformed him from aspiring artist into frontier lawman, Jacob had demonstrated natural ability for capturing human emotion in dramatic scenes and oil paintings that impressed even his sophisticated Boston instructors. Those skills, maintained through years of sketching ranch scenes, livestock records, and landscape studies that helped him understand the play of light and shadow across Colorado's mountain terrain, would now serve a more sinister purpose. Working by candlelight in his ranch house kitchen while Kate and Marcus maintained security watches that had become necessary since Crowfield's organization began hunting them, Jacob created 5 paintings that depicted Crowfield's crimes in vivid, unmistakable detail that would haunt any viewer. Each canvas measured 12 inches by 16 inches, small enough for easy transport and concealment, but large enough to create maximum psychological impact when displayed in strategic locations. The first painting showed Crowfield strangling Elena Morrison with his bare hands, her face rendered with photographic accuracy that could only come from intimate knowledge of the victim's features. Every detail was perfect. The terror in her eyes, the defensive wounds on her hands, the expensive dress she had worn to what she thought would be a simple business meeting at the bank. The second painting depicted a mass grave containing 23 victims, their faces emerging from dark earth like accusations against their killer. Jacob had never seen these other victims, but he painted them as representatives of all innocent people who had died for Crowfield's profit, their expressions pleading for justice that had been denied too long. The third painting showed Thunderbolt running free through mountain landscapes that stretched to the horizon, symbolizing freedom from tyranny and the wild spirit that no amount of money could truly own. This image would remind Crowfield that some things remain beyond his control, no matter how much wealth and power he accumulated through criminal means. The fourth painting portrayed a courtroom scene with Crowfield in chains, facing judgment from a jury composed of his victims who had returned from death to demand justice. The composition drew upon classical religious imagery of final judgment, suggesting that earthly crimes would ultimately face divine retribution. The fifth and most disturbing painting showed Daniel Morrison's ghost pointing an accusing finger at his murderer, surrounded by legal documents that would ensure justice even from beyond the grave. The supernatural elements were calculated to exploit the superstitious fears that even sophisticated criminals harbored in their darkest moments. Each painting included specific details that only someone with intimate knowledge of the crimes could have known. The exact position of wounds on victims' bodies, the clothing worn during their final moments, the precise locations where murders had occurred. The message was clear and terrifying. Someone knew everything, someone who could not be bought or intimidated into silence. Jacob delivered the paintings simultaneously across town during pre-dawn hours when Crowfield's guards were least alert, using knowledge gained from 15 years of law enforcement to avoid patrols and surveillance systems that protected the most sensitive locations. Strategic placement ensured that Crowfield would encounter each image throughout his normal daily routine, creating a psychological siege that would intensify throughout the day. The first painting, positioned in the bank office where Elena had been murdered, was discovered at 7 o'clock in the morning when Crowfield arrived to conduct what he believed would be routine business. His initial anger at this violation of his private space gave way to growing paranoia as additional images were found throughout the day at locations where he conducted his various enterprises. By noon, 5 paintings had created a psychological siege that left Crowfield pacing his mansion corridors like a trapped animal, studying the windows for watchers who might be observing his reactions and jumping at unexpected sounds that might herald the approach of enemies he could not identify or locate. Staff members reported that their employer's usually immaculate appearance became increasingly disheveled as the day progressed, and his decision-making abilities deteriorated noticeably under the psychological pressure. Crowfield's alcohol consumption increased dramatically as he sought liquid courage to face threats that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Sleep deprivation became evident in his bloodshot eyes and trembling hands, and servants whispered among themselves about their employer's apparent descent into madness. The psychological warfare was achieving its intended effect, but it also accelerated Crowfield's timeline for eliminating the enemies who dared to challenge his authority in such a personal and terrifying manner. December 26th afternoon brought Jacob, Kate, Marcus, and Billy to Devil's Canyon cave system through terrain that challenged even experienced mountain travelers accustomed to Colorado's unforgiving geography. Narrow paths covered with treacherous ice wound between rock formations that could conceal ambushes or simply collapse without warning onto anyone foolish enough to venture into such dangerous territory during winter months. Visibility remained limited by continuing snow showers that transformed familiar landmarks into alien shapes, and temperatures that threatened frostbite made every exposed moment potentially fatal. The journey required nearly 3 hours of careful navigation, with frequent stops to rest horses and check that young Billy was not succumbing to exposure that could kill him as surely as any bullet. The cave system itself represented millions of years of geological history, limestone formations carved by underground streams that had created chambers large enough to house entire buildings. The main chamber measured 40 feet by 25 feet with 12-foot ceilings that disappeared into darkness beyond their lantern light, while side passages extended more than 200 feet into the mountainside through corridors that ancient waters had carved with infinite patience. Temperature remained constant at 45 degrees year-round, creating natural preservation in environments that Daniel Morrison had recognized as perfect for protecting crucial evidence from both weather damage and human interference. The caves had been used by Native Americans for generations, then by trappers and miners who needed secure storage for valuable supplies, and finally by Daniel Morrison for purposes that would determine whether justice or corruption would triumph in their struggle. Daniel's hiding place occupied the deepest accessible chamber, concealed behind rock formations that appeared natural but had been carefully arranged to hide the steel strongbox that contained evidence worth more than all of Crowfield's stolen wealth. The strongbox itself was military surplus from the Civil War, built to withstand artillery bombardment and featuring a combination lock that required precise knowledge of the three-number sequence Billy had memorized during his final conversation with his uncle. 4, 23, 81. Elena's birthday converted to numbers that would unlock secrets capable of destroying the most powerful criminal organization in Colorado territory. The strong box contained documentation that revealed the true scope of Crowfield's criminal enterprise. Information so comprehensive and damning that its discovery would mark the beginning of the end for every corrupt official and criminal associate who had participated in the conspiracy. Financial records showed $47,000 in stolen cash hidden in various caches throughout the territory, money that represented the life savings of families who had been cheated out of their property through forged documents and manipulated legal proceedings. 156 forged land deeds affected 47,000 acres of prime real estate that had been systematically stolen over 4 years of criminal activity. Railroad contracts worth $890,000 in profit over 10 years demonstrated the massive scale of a conspiracy that involved some of the most powerful corporations in America. These companies had knowingly participated in criminal activities that saved them hundreds of thousands of dollars in legitimate land acquisition costs, money that could have provided fair compensation to families who had spent generations building homes on frontier land. Murder documentation provided complete lists of 23 assassination victims whose deaths had been orchestrated over 4 years of systematic elimination of anyone who threatened Crowfield's operations. Detailed descriptions of methods included poison for 7 victims, staged accidents for 9 victims, shootings for 4 victims, and drownings for 3 victims. The professional killers employed by the organization included Reynolds, Carter, and 6 other men whose identities had never been suspected by legitimate law enforcement agencies. The conspiracy's scope extended far beyond simple land fraud into systematic corruption of territorial institutions that were supposed to protect honest citizens from exactly these kinds of criminal enterprises. Banking networks laundered stolen funds across state lines, moving money through legitimate businesses that provided cover for criminal profits. Mining companies coordinated water rights theft that left entire communities without access to resources essential for survival. Railroad partnerships manipulated federal land policies to benefit private interests at the expense of public welfare. But among all these documents, Jacob found correspondence that would transform their understanding of Crowfield's crimes from business conspiracy motivated by profit into something far more personal and vindictive. Letters between Crowfield and someone identified only as EC discussed basement guest management with clinical detachment that revealed systematic torture extending over more than 2 years. Medical treatment schedules, sedation procedures, and information extraction sessions were described in language that suggested prolonged imprisonment under conditions that violated every standard of human decency. The mysterious EC was identified through additional documentation as Elizabeth Collins, 21-year-old daughter of Judge William Collins, who had served on the territorial bench until his sudden retirement and departure from Colorado in late 1881. Elizabeth had disappeared on September 8, 1881, following what had been reported to territorial authorities as a tragic riding accident in terrain known for its dangerous conditions. Her father had retired immediately after her disappearance, selling his substantial property holdings at well below market value and moving to California without providing explanations that satisfied anyone who knew him. The speed of his departure had seemed suspicious to some observers, but Judge Collins had been sufficiently respected that few people questioned his decision to seek a new life following his daughter's apparent death. Judge Collins's corruption was revealed through financial records that documented his acceptance of $12,000 in bribes to dismiss charges against Crowfield in an 1881 land dispute case that should have resulted in criminal prosecution and prison sentences. When Elizabeth discovered her father's corruption and threatened to expose his crimes to federal authorities, Crowfield had eliminated the threat through kidnapping rather than murder, keeping her alive as leverage to ensure her father's continued silence and cooperation. For more than 2 years, Elizabeth Collins had endured basement imprisonment while her father maintained public silence about her disappearance, choosing his own survival and reputation over his daughter's freedom and dignity. Judge Collins's sudden retirement hadn't been grief-related but fear-motivated. The desperate act of a broken man who had sold his integrity and sacrificed his daughter to protect secrets that would destroy his career and possibly his life. Elizabeth's rescue had become an immediate moral imperative that transcended their original mission of seeking justice for Elena's murder. But it would also expose them to Crowfield's most heavily defended position at a time when their enemy was already searching for them with increasing desperation and violence. December 27th brought information warfare as Jacob's alliance systematically distributed evidence of Crowfield's crimes throughout Frostwood Creek's 847 residents, creating the kind of public pressure that even the most corrupt officials could not ignore indefinitely. Kate's boarding house provided an excellent distribution network through 12 influential traveling guests whose business took them throughout Colorado Territory and beyond. These men included railroad surveyors, mining equipment salesmen, cattle buyers, and territorial officials whose work put them in contact with law enforcement agencies and business leaders across multiple communities. Their credibility and extensive contacts made them ideal messengers for information that needed to reach the widest possible audience. Marcus Reed's law enforcement connections included 5 deputies and 1 sheriff from neighboring jurisdictions who possessed both the authority and the motivation to investigate criminal activities that threatened the integrity of territorial institutions. These men had sworn oaths to uphold justice, and most of them took those commitments seriously despite the corruption that infected some aspects of territorial government. Henry McCann's blacksmith shop served as an unofficial meeting place for 67 local ranchers whose economic interests had been directly damaged by Crowfield's land manipulation schemes. These men controlled significant political influence within their communities and possessed the kind of practical knowledge about property values and ownership histories that would allow them to verify many of the accusations being made against Crowfield's organization. The information campaign focused on evidence that ordinary residents could verify through their own experience and knowledge of local affairs. Names of 23 murder victims included several men who were well known and respected within their communities, whose deaths had seemed suspicious at the time but had never been properly investigated due to Crowfield's influence over local law enforcement. Financial details of the land theft scheme were presented with specific examples that residents could confirm by checking territorial land office records. Railroad conspiracy documentation explains suspicious changes in development patterns that had puzzled observers but had never been connected to criminal activity. Proof of territorial government corruption provided names and specific instances of bribery that had allowed criminal activities to proceed without legal consequences. Public reaction divided along predictable lines that reflected both economic interests and moral convictions. 312 residents, mostly ranchers, farmers, and working-class families who had suffered directly under Crowfield's economic control, immediately believed the accusations and demanded immediate action against the criminal organization that had exploited them for years. 278 residents, including business owners, professionals, and town officials, whose financial welfare depended on maintaining good relationships with Crowfield's various enterprises, rejected the evidence as fabricated and accused Jacob Sterling of pursuing personal vengeance rather than legitimate justice. These individuals had too much to lose from Crowfield's downfall to accept evidence of his criminal activities, regardless of how compelling that evidence might be. The remaining 257 residents adopted cautious wait-and-see attitudes, demanding additional proof before choosing sides in a conflict that could determine Frostwood Creek's future direction and their own personal fortunes. These people understood the stakes involved, but lacked either the courage or the conviction to commit themselves to either faction without stronger assurances about the eventual outcome. The division culminated in a town meeting that Crowfield called for 7 o'clock in the evening at Frostwood Creek Community Hall, a building whose 200-person capacity was overwhelmed by 267 attendees who packed into every available space. The atmosphere crackled with tension that threatened to explode into violence as opposing factions faced each other across lines that divided families, friends, and business partners. Crowfield's strategy focused on personal attacks against his accusers rather than addressing the evidence they had presented, a tactical decision that revealed both his desperation and his fundamental misunderstanding of public opinion. He chose to reveal Kate Whitmore's true identity as Victoria Hammond, claiming she was a wanted fugitive with a $200 federal bounty for bank fraud committed in St. Louis before her arrival in Frostwood Creek. The charges were partially fabricated, but contained enough truth to create the confusion Crowfield needed to discredit his enemies. While Kate's false identity was confirmed by territorial records that Crowfield's contacts had provided, the criminal allegations had been invented specifically to provide ammunition for exactly this kind of character assassination. The revelation shook public confidence in Jacob's alliance, creating doubts about their motives and credibility that would require time and additional evidence to overcome completely. The town meeting dissolved into shouting matches between pro-Crowfield and pro-Sterling factions, with accusations and counter-accusations flying across the crowded hall like verbal bullets. Men who had been friends for decades found themselves on opposite sides of issues that threatened to tear their community apart. Women clutched their children and moved toward exits as the potential for physical violence increased with every angry exchange. No clear victor emerged from the chaos, but the meeting had served Crowfield's immediate purpose of preventing his enemies from achieving the unanimous public support they needed to force his resignation or departure from Frostwood Creek. As long as the community remained divided, he could continue operating under the protection of supporters who had too much invested in his success to abandon him easily. But as the meeting ended and residents filed out into the cold December night, their heated arguments continuing in smaller groups that gathered on street corners and in front of businesses, Elizabeth Collins herself provided evidence that would shatter Crowfield's remaining credibility forever. Elizabeth had escaped from Crowfield's mansion basement during the confusion created by the town meeting, when most of his guards were monitoring the community hall for signs of organized resistance or violence that might threaten their employer's interests. She had used a hairpin lockpicking technique learned during more than 2 years of imprisonment, skills acquired through endless hours of practice that had provided hope during her darkest moments. Malnourished to the point of obvious physical weakness, wearing torn clothing that revealed evidence of prolonged abuse, bearing scars and bruises that told stories of systematic torture, she staggered through the community hall's front door just as the meeting concluded and residents were preparing to leave. Her appearance silenced both factions immediately and completely. Even Crowfield's most loyal supporters, men who had defended him against every accusation and dismissed every piece of evidence as fabricated lies, could not deny the visual proof of imprisonment, torture, and systematic abuse that stood before them in the person of a young woman they had believed dead for more than 2 years. Elizabeth Collins had been the daughter of one of Colorado Territory's most respected judges, a beautiful and intelligent young woman whose disappearance had been mourned throughout the region. Her return from what everyone assumed was death provided testimony more powerful than any document or witness statement could ever achieve. Elizabeth's story, told in a voice weakened by malnutrition but strengthened by 2 years of surviving hell, provided the missing pieces of evidence that would ensure Crowfield's destruction. As an eyewitness to Daniel and Elena Morrison's murders, she could provide courtroom testimony that would guarantee convictions even in corrupted courts. Her knowledge of Judge Collins's bribery and corruption would expose the judicial manipulation that had protected Crowfield from prosecution for years. Most importantly, she possessed detailed information about Crowfield's final contingency plan, information that would save lives and prevent the massacre he had planned to eliminate all witnesses to his crimes. The Dalton gang had been contacted and hired to conduct systematic assassinations of everyone who posed a threat to Crowfield's continued operations. 12 professional killers had been brought from Denver specifically for mass elimination operations that would cost $1,800 total, with individual contracts ranging from $150 per adult target to $50 for each child who might someday grow up to seek vengeance. The target list included 47 people: Jacob Sterling and his alliance, their family members, and anyone who had provided significant support for their investigation. Marcus Reed's wife and children were scheduled for elimination, as were Henry McCann and his family, and dozens of other residents whose only crime had been believing that justice was more important than profit. Elizabeth revealed that the killing was scheduled to begin at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning on December 28th, with coordinated attacks on Sterling Ranch and supporter homes throughout the area. Crowfield had accelerated his timeline after the town meeting, recognizing that his political position had become untenable and that only the complete elimination of his enemies could preserve his criminal empire. But even as Elizabeth spoke, providing intelligence that would allow them to prepare defensive measures, the distant sound of gunfire echoed from the direction of Sterling Ranch. The attack had already begun, and Marcus Reed's family was fighting for their lives against professional killers who showed no mercy to anyone who stood between them and their assigned targets. Jacob, Kate, Billy, and Elizabeth mounted horses and raced through snow toward the sound of battle, knowing they were riding into a carefully planned ambush designed to eliminate them permanently. The final phase of their 7-day war against corruption had begun ahead of schedule, and the stakes were no longer simply justice or revenge. They were fighting for survival itself, and for the future of everyone they loved in a territory where law had been replaced by the will of men who recognized no authority beyond their own greed and ambition. The war for Frostwood Creek's soul was about to reach its bloody and decisive climax. December 27th, 11 o'clock at night, the sound of gunfire echoed across the frozen landscape like thunder rolling through mountain valleys, each shot carrying with it the promise of death and the certainty that innocent blood was being spilled in service of evil ambitions. Marcus Reed's farmhouse stood under siege, surrounded by professional killers who had traveled from Denver for the specific purpose of eliminating everyone who dared to oppose Silas Crowfield's criminal empire. Jacob Sterling, Kate Whitmore, Billy Morrison, and Elizabeth Collins rode through snow that reached past their horses' bellies, pushing their mounts to speeds that bordered on suicidal in terrain where a single misstep could send horse and rider tumbling into ravines that would become frozen graves. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees below zero, and the wind cut through even the heaviest clothing like razor blades seeking flesh. But none of them felt the cold that should have killed them within minutes of exposure. They were riding toward a battle that would determine not only their own survival, but the fate of everyone they loved in a territory where justice had been replaced by the will of men who recognized no authority beyond their own greed and capacity for violence. The Reed farmhouse sat in a shallow valley 2 miles from Sterling Ranch, a modest 2-story structure that Marcus had built with his own hands after marrying Sarah Mitchell 3 years earlier. It should have been a symbol of hope and domestic happiness, a place where children could grow up surrounded by love and security. Instead, it had become a fortress under siege, with 6 members of the Dalton gang positioned at strategic points around the property, their Winchester rifles spitting flame into the darkness as they attempted to murder a family whose only crime was believing that truth mattered more than money. Jacob surveyed the tactical situation from a ridge overlooking the valley, his military experience from the Civil War providing knowledge that civilian law enforcement could never have taught him. The attackers had positioned themselves professionally, covering all escape routes and maintaining fields of fire that would prevent anyone from approaching the house without being cut down. These were not ordinary gunmen motivated by simple greed, but professional killers who understood their business and took pride in their efficiency. Marcus Reed's voice could be heard shouting orders from inside the farmhouse, where he was coordinating defensive fire with his wife Sarah and his 2 children, 6-year-old Michael and 4-year-old Anna. The family had fortified themselves in the storm cellar beneath the kitchen, using the stone foundation as protection against rifle bullets that could penetrate wooden walls like paper. The siege had been underway for more than an hour, and ammunition was becoming a critical factor. Marcus carried standard law enforcement equipment, sufficient for normal duties but inadequate for sustained combat against professional assassins. The children were crying, their voices audible even above the gunfire, and Sarah Reed was returning fire with her husband's backup revolver despite having no combat experience beyond the basic marksmanship that frontier life demanded of every adult. Jacob's tactical assessment revealed both advantages and disadvantages that would determine the outcome of their rescue attempt. The advantage lay in surprise and superior knowledge of local terrain that the Denver killers could not match. The disadvantage was numbers: 6 professional assassins against 4 rescuers, with innocent civilians trapped in the crossfire. But Jacob Sterling had not survived 22 years of frontier law enforcement and military service by accepting unfavorable odds as insurmountable obstacles. He had learned that determination, careful planning, and willingness to take calculated risks could overcome superior firepower when applied with intelligence and precision. "Kate, you take position on the eastern ridge," Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that howled through the pine trees surrounding their position. Your federal marshal training gives you the best long-range accuracy. Pick your targets carefully and make every shot count. Kate nodded, checking her Smith& Wesson 38 one final time before moving toward the position that would give her clear lines of sight to 3 of the 6 attackers. Her movements were professional and confident, revealing training that went far beyond what most frontier women possessed. "Elizabeth, you stay here with Billy," Jacob continued, his weathered hand resting on the boy's shoulder with paternal protectiveness. "Keep the horses ready for immediate departure. If this goes badly, you ride straight to Sterling Ranch and barricade yourselves in the root cellar until help arrives." Elizabeth Collins, despite her physical weakness from 2 years of imprisonment and torture, possessed the kind of inner strength that could not be broken by any amount of suffering. "Mr. Sterling, I may be weak, but I can still handle a weapon if necessary." Jacob studied her face in the dim starlight, seeing determination that reminded him powerfully of his murdered daughter, Elena. "I know you can, Miss Collins, but those children in there need someone alive to tell their story if we don't make it out. That responsibility matters more than anything else." The plan Jacob formulated drew upon every tactical lesson he had learned during decades of dangerous work, modified for terrain and weather conditions that added complexity to an already desperate situation. Kate would provide covering fire from elevation, picking off attackers who exposed themselves while trying to maintain their siege positions. Jacob would approach from the north, using a dry creek bed that offered concealment until he could reach effective range with his Winchester rifle. The most dangerous part of the operation would be crossing the open ground between the creek bed and the farmhouse, 50 yards of snow-covered valley floor that offered no protection against rifle fire from professional marksmen. But Marcus Reed and his family would die if no one was willing to take that risk. And Jacob Sterling had long ago learned that some things were worth dying for. The battle erupted with sudden violence that transformed the peaceful winter landscape into a scene from hell itself. Kate's first shot dropped one of the assassins with the kind of precision that comes from federal law enforcement training, her bullet finding its target despite darkness and wind that would have challenged even experienced shooters. Jacob's Winchester began its deadly work immediately afterward, laying down suppressing fire that forced the remaining attackers to seek cover behind outbuildings and fence posts that provided inadequate protection against a determined marksman who knew every inch of the terrain. His shots were carefully aimed and methodically placed, each one designed to either eliminate a target or force movement that would expose the enemy to Kate's position on the ridge. The gunfight developed into a deadly chess game played with bullets and blood, where every decision carried life or death consequences and mistakes were measured in human lives rather than simple tactical disadvantage. The professional assassins possessed superior firepower and ammunition supplies, but they lacked knowledge of local conditions and had not anticipated facing opponents with military training and federal law enforcement experience. Marcus Reed joined the battle from inside the farmhouse, contributing firepower with his Remington 44, while his wife reloaded weapons and maintained watch over their terrified children. The stone foundation that protected the family also limited their ability to engage targets, but Marcus's knowledge of his own property allowed him to make shots through windows and doorways that the attackers had not anticipated. The turning point came when Jacob recognized the attack pattern his enemies were using, a coordinated assault technique that he had seen employed during the Civil War by Confederate raiders who specialized in overwhelming isolated positions through concentrated firepower. The assassins were preparing to storm the farmhouse simultaneously from 3 directions, a maneuver that would almost certainly succeed unless it could be disrupted before it reached full development. Jacob made his decision with the speed that had characterized every important choice of his adult life, abandoning the relative safety of his creek bed position to sprint across open ground toward the farmhouse. Rifle bullets whined past his ears like angry hornets, and snow exploded around his boots as enemy marksmen tried to cut him down before he could reach cover. But 45 years of frontier life had kept Jacob Sterling in the kind of physical condition that younger men envied, and desperation lent wings to his feet as he covered ground that should have been a killing field. He reached the farmhouse's stone foundation just as the coordinated assault began, arriving in time to add his firepower to the defensive effort that would determine whether the Reed family lived or died. The battle reached its climax in the farmhouse kitchen, where hand-to-hand combat replaced long-range marksmanship as the final two assassins breached the building's defenses and attempted to complete their mission through close-quarters violence. Jacob found himself facing Reynolds, Crowfield's chief enforcer, in a fight that tested every skill he had acquired during decades of dangerous work. Reynolds was younger and faster, but Jacob possessed the kind of desperate strength that comes from protecting innocent lives and the tactical knowledge that only experience could provide. When Reynolds' ammunition ran out, the fight became a brutal test of endurance and determination that would end only when one man could no longer continue. Jacob's victory came through the application of a combat technique learned during his military service, a move that disabled his opponent without killing him, preserving a witness whose testimony would prove crucial in bringing Crowfield to justice. Reynolds lay unconscious on the farmhouse floor, alive but no longer a threat to anyone. The siege was broken, but the cost had been significant. Marcus Reed had suffered a minor wound from flying splinters when rifle bullets penetrated the kitchen wall. Sarah Reed was uninjured, but traumatized by her family's brush with death. The children would require time to recover from nightmares that might last for years. Most importantly, they had captured one of Crowfield's professional killers alive, a man whose knowledge of the conspiracy's operations would provide crucial intelligence for the final confrontation that could no longer be avoided or delayed. The fifth and sixth days had seen the systematic destruction of Crowfield's remaining assets. Tom Brelly's betrayal had been discovered when Marcus Reed found evidence of his secret communications with Crowfield's organization. The deputy's desperate attempt to protect his family had cost him his badge and nearly his life, but it had also provided Jacob's alliance with crucial intelligence about Crowfield's final plans. Day 5 had targeted Crowfield's business empire. The general store burned under mysterious circumstances. The warehouse was found empty of valuable goods, and several of his key financial records disappeared from the territorial office. Day 6 brought the collapse of his political protection when federal marshals arrived to arrest Judge Henderson and Sheriff Parker on corruption charges. December 28th, 1 o'clock in the morning. Silas Crowfield stood in his mansion study, facing the complete collapse of everything he had spent years building through murder, fraud, and systematic corruption. Reports from his surviving operatives painted a picture of total disaster that even his considerable wealth and political connections might not be able to overcome. The Dalton gang assault on the Reed farmhouse had failed catastrophically, with 4 professional assassins dead and Reynolds captured alive by enemies who now possessed detailed knowledge of Crowfield's final contingency plans. Elizabeth Collins had escaped from her basement prison and revealed secrets that would destroy every corrupt official who had enabled his criminal activities. Most damaging of all, the documents hidden in Devil's Canyon had been recovered and would soon be in the hands of federal authorities who could not be bought or intimidated. Crowfield's response to these disasters revealed both his desperation and his fundamental inability to accept defeat gracefully. Rather than attempting to negotiate terms or seeking escape through the underground networks that had served him well in the past, he chose to implement the most destructive option available: total elimination of all evidence and witnesses through systematic arson that would reduce Frostwood Creek to ashes. The plan was conceived with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized all of Crowfield's criminal enterprises, but it was motivated by rage and desperation rather than careful calculation of costs and benefits. 12 simultaneous fires would be ignited using kerosene and dynamite at strategic locations throughout the town: the bank that contained financial records, the courthouse that housed legal documents, Sterling Ranch and other properties owned by his enemies, plus residential areas where families who had opposed him might seek shelter. The goal was not simply destruction of evidence, but complete elimination of the community that had dared to challenge his authority. 847 residents would be forced to choose between fleeing into winter weather that could kill them or remaining in buildings that would become death traps once the fires reached full intensity. Crowfield's escape preparation revealed the scope of resources he had accumulated through years of criminal activity. $47,000 in cash was loaded into wagons, along with selected documents that proved his partnerships with railroad companies and territorial officials. The plan called for departure during the confusion created by multiple fires, followed by relocation to California, where new identities and business relationships would allow him to continue operating without interference from federal law enforcement. But Elizabeth Collins' 2 years of imprisonment had provided her with detailed knowledge of Crowfield's contingency plans, information that she shared with Jacob and his allies as they prepared for the final confrontation that would determine whether justice or corruption would triumph in their struggle. "He's not just planning to burn evidence," Elizabeth warned, her voice steady despite the exhaustion and trauma that marked her recent escape from captivity. "He wants to kill everyone who knows the truth about his crimes. The fires are designed to trap families in their homes, making escape impossible once the blaze reaches full intensity." The intelligence Elizabeth provided allowed Jacob to formulate a defensive strategy that addressed both the immediate threat of coordinated arson and the longer-term need to capture Crowfield alive for federal prosecution. The plan required splitting their limited forces to protect multiple targets simultaneously while maintaining enough offensive capability to penetrate Crowfield's final stronghold. Marcus Reed would lead a team of volunteer firefighters to protect the courthouse and bank, ensuring that crucial evidence survived even if other buildings were lost to the flames. Kate Whitmore would coordinate civilian evacuation efforts, using her federal authority to organize resistance among townspeople who had previously remained neutral in their conflict with Crowfield's organization. Jacob and Billy would assault Crowfield's mansion directly, seeking to capture the criminal leader before he could escape to continue his activities in other territories. Elizabeth would remain at a safe distance, serving as a witness whose survival was essential for any future legal proceedings that might result from their night's work. The assault began at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, precisely the time when Crowfield had planned to begin his campaign of systematic murder and destruction. But instead of defenseless victims waiting to be slaughtered, his hired arsonists encountered organized resistance that had been preparing for their arrival. 12 fires ignited simultaneously across Frostwood Creek, creating an apocalyptic scene that was visible for miles across the frozen landscape. Orange flames reflected off snow and ice, creating visual effects that resembled biblical visions of hell unleashed upon the earth. The sound of crackling wood and exploding buildings mixed with human screams and the confused bellowing of livestock to create an auditory nightmare that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. But the fires that should have created chaos and terror instead galvanized the community into collective action that demonstrated the fundamental difference between Crowfield's hired criminals and ordinary people fighting to protect their homes and families. Volunteer firefighters organized bucket brigades from the partially frozen creek, while women and children were evacuated to predetermined safe areas where they could ride out the disaster. Jacob's approach to Crowfield's mansion took him through streets that resembled a war zone, where burning buildings cast dancing shadows that concealed both allies and enemies. The stone mansion itself appeared impregnable, its thick walls and elevated position providing natural advantages that would challenge even experienced attackers. But Jacob Sterling possessed something that no amount of money could purchase: intimate knowledge of the building's construction, gained through his years as sheriff when he had been a frequent visitor for social and business purposes. He knew about the wine cellar entrance that connected to the old brewery tunnels, passages that had been carved into the hillside during Prohibition years, when alcohol smuggling provided substantial profits for anyone willing to violate federal law. The underground approach allowed Jacob and Billy to penetrate Crowfield's defenses without alerting the guards who were focused on external threats they expected to come from the burning streets below. The tunnels themselves were narrow and treacherous, carved through solid rock with hand tools and offering barely enough space for a grown man to navigate without becoming trapped in passages that could become tombs if structural damage blocked the exits. They emerged into the mansion's basement wine cellar, where Elizabeth Collins had spent 2 years in captivity that would have broken weaker spirits. The sight of her former prison cell filled Jacob with rage that threatened to overwhelm the tactical discipline that kept him alive in dangerous situations. But Billy's presence provided the anchor that kept him focused on their mission rather than personal vengeance. The mansion's interior reflected Crowfield's wealth and sophisticated tastes, but it also revealed the paranoia that had grown within him during the weeks since Jacob had begun his campaign of systematic destruction. Extra guards were posted at every entrance. Weapons were stored in convenient locations throughout the building, and escape routes had been prepared for immediate use if circumstances required hasty departure. Jacob and Billy moved through the building like ghosts, using skills learned through decades of frontier law enforcement and frontier survival to avoid detection by guards who were trained to watch for external threats rather than enemies who had already penetrated their defensive perimeter. Their goal was Crowfield's study, where the criminal leader was making final preparations for his escape from justice. The confrontation, when it finally came, took place in the same room where Crowfield had planned Elizabeth Collins' imprisonment and ordered the murders of Daniel and Elena Morrison. The symbolism was not lost on Jacob Sterling, who understood that justice often required returning evil to the places where it had been conceived and nurtured. Silas Crowfield stood behind his massive mahogany desk, $40,000 in cash stacked in neat piles beside a revolver that represented his final insurance against capture. At 40 years old, he remained physically impressive, but his usual composure had been shattered by the systematic destruction of everything he had spent years building through criminal enterprise. Jacob Sterling, Crowfield said, his voice carrying the kind of forced calm that men use when facing circumstances beyond their control. I wondered when you would finally work up the courage to face me directly instead of hiding behind your hired assassins and federal marshals. Jacob stepped into the lamplight, Billy remaining in the shadows where his presence would provide tactical advantage if violence became necessary. I'm not here to hide behind anyone, Crowfield. I'm here to finish what you started when you murdered my daughter. Your daughter was an unfortunate casualty of business necessity, Crowfield replied with casual indifference that revealed his complete lack of human empathy. She discovered information that could have interfered with profitable arrangements. Her elimination was simply a rational business decision. The words struck Jacob like physical blows, confirming everything he had suspected about the man who had destroyed his family for nothing more than financial convenience. But instead of triggering the explosion of rage that Crowfield might have expected, they produced the kind of cold determination that made Jacob Sterling far more dangerous than any ordinary killer, motivated by simple emotions. Business, Jacob repeated quietly. 23 murders for business. 2 years of torture for a woman whose only crime was having an honest father. Stealing the life savings of families who trusted you with their futures. And all just business. Crowfield's hand moved incrementally closer to his revolver, but Jacob's own weapon remained steady and aimed with the kind of precision that comes from decades of practice under life-threatening conditions. The criminal leader was fast and desperate, but Jacob Sterling was faster and had more experience with situations where seconds meant the difference between life and death. The world belongs to men with vision and the courage to take what they want, Crowfield said, revealing the philosophy that had guided his criminal career. Your daughter lacked that understanding. She thought sentiment and legal technicalities mattered more than practical reality. She thought justice mattered more than money, Jacob corrected. That's why she's dead, and that's why you're going to answer for her murder and every other crime you've committed. For a long moment, the two men faced each other across the lamplight, each reading the other's intentions. Crowfield's hand trembled slightly as it hovered near his revolver, not from fear, but from the accumulated stress of 6 days watching his empire crumble, piece by piece. You think you've won, Crowfield said, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. But there are others, men in Denver, in Washington. This conspiracy extends far beyond one small town. Then they'll fall too, Jacob replied calmly, one by one until every last trace of corruption is burned away. The gunfight erupted with lightning speed. Crowfield's desperation made him fast, but desperation also made him careless. Jacob's bullet found its mark with deadly precision, while Crowfield's shot went wide, shattering the window behind Jacob. Jacob's bullet found its target with the kind of accuracy that only comes from righteous purpose combined with superior skill. Silas Crowfield collapsed behind his desk, wounded but not dead, his revolver clattering across the polished wooden floor as blood spread across his expensive white shirt. The man who had terrorized an entire territory through murder and corruption was reduced to a bleeding, frightened criminal who could no longer hide behind hired killers and corrupt officials. It's finished, Jacob said, kneeling beside the fallen man to check his wounds and ensure he would survive long enough to face justice in federal court. Your empire is destroyed, your secrets are exposed, and your victims will finally have their day in court. But even as Jacob spoke those words, The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Kate Whitmore and Marcus Reed, who had successfully coordinated the firefighting efforts that saved most of Frostwood Creek from the destruction Crowfield had planned. Their presence confirmed that the community had survived its greatest test and emerged stronger than before. Elizabeth Collins appeared in the study doorway, her presence serving as a living symbol of justice triumphant over corruption and evil. The woman who had endured 2 years of imprisonment and torture had lived to see her tormentor brought to account for crimes that had seemed beyond the reach of earthly justice. Federal marshals are en route from Denver, Kate announced, her official authority restored by the evidence they had gathered and the witnesses they had preserved. Crowfield will face trial for every charge we can prove, and the conspiracy he led will be dismantled completely. The aftermath of their victory would require months of legal proceedings, witness testimony, and federal investigations that would reach into territorial governments across the American West. But the immediate threat had been eliminated, and justice had been served through the courage and determination of ordinary people who refused to accept corruption as inevitable. Spring arrived early in 1884, bringing with it the kind of renewal and hope that follows the end of long, harsh winters. Frostwood Creek had been rebuilt and renamed Justice Springs in honor of the struggle that had transformed it from a community living under criminal tyranny into a place where law and justice could flourish. The wedding of Jacob Sterling and Victoria Hammond took place on the first warm day of March, with the entire population of Justice Springs in attendance to celebrate the union of two people who had found love and partnership in the midst of their fight against evil. Billy Morrison served as ring bearer, wearing new clothes that marked his transition from orphaned victim to beloved grandson in a family that would provide the security and affection he needed to overcome his traumatic experiences. Elizabeth Collins had recovered her strength and dignity through months of careful treatment and genuine friendship from people who understood that healing required time and patience. She established Justice Springs' first school, providing education for children who would grow up in a community where truth and justice were valued above wealth and power. Marcus Reed accepted appointment as permanent sheriff when Jacob chose to retire from law enforcement to focus on ranch operations and family life. The new sheriff brought integrity and competence to a position that had been corrupted for too long, ensuring that Justice Springs would never again fall under the control of criminals who mistook fear for respect. The Sterling Ranch prospered as it never had before, expanding to encompass nearly 5,000 acres of prime Colorado rangeland that supported herds of cattle and horses that were renowned throughout the territory. But more important than material success was the restoration of the family bonds that had been shattered by Crowfield's crimes and renewed through their shared struggle for justice. On warm summer evenings, Jacob would sit on his front porch with Victoria and Billy, watching the sun set behind mountain peaks that had witnessed both the darkest and brightest chapters of their lives. The old man's hands were finally steady again, no longer shaking with the rage and grief that had consumed him during the terrible winter when everything seemed lost. Billy Morrison grew into young manhood with the kind of strength and character that comes from surviving tragedy and emerging with faith intact rather than spirits broken. He learned ranching skills from his grandfather, artistic techniques that honored the memory of his murdered parents, and most importantly, the values of courage and integrity that would guide him throughout his adult life. The boy who had walked 12 miles through a blizzard to seek justice for his family became a man who understood that true strength comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves, that real wealth lies in relationships built on love and trust, and that justice is not something that happens automatically, but something that must be fought for and defended by every generation. 30 years later, in 1913, as 75-year-old Jacob Sterling sat by his fireplace telling 8-year-old Tommy about the winter that changed everything, the lessons remained as relevant as they had been during those 7 days when good and evil faced each other in mortal combat. "Remember this, Tommy," Jacob concluded, placing his weathered hand on his great-grandson's shoulder with the kind of gentle strength that comes from a life well lived. "Evil grows stronger when good men wait too long to act. When your time comes to choose between what's easy and what's right, choose courage. Choose justice. Choose the kind of life that honors those who came before you and protects those who will come after." The boy nodded solemnly, understanding that he was receiving more than just a story about the past. He was being entrusted with values and responsibilities that would define not only his own character, but the character of generations yet to be born. Outside the ranch house windows, snow fell gently across land that had been bought with blood and defended with courage. Land that would provide security and prosperity for Sterling descendants as long as they remember the lessons learned during that terrible and magnificent winter when justice triumphed over corruption through the determination of ordinary people who refused to accept evil as inevitable. The war for Justice Spring's soul had been won, but the eternal struggle between good and evil would continue in every generation, requiring new heroes and new acts of courage from men and women who understood that freedom and justice are never permanently secured but must be earned anew by each generation that inherits them. Jacob Sterling's legacy was not the wealth he had accumulated or the land he had claimed, but the example he had set of what one man could accomplish when principle mattered more than personal safety, when love for family and community provided strength to face seemingly impossible odds, and when the choice between right and wrong became clear enough to demand action regardless of the consequences. The winter's last stand had become the foundation for a lifetime of honor, and the 7 days that tested one man's courage had created a legacy that would endure as long as people remembered that justice is not a gift that comes without cost, but a treasure that must be purchased with the highest price that human beings can pay: the willingness to sacrifice everything for principles that transcend individual survival. In the end, that was the story Tommy would carry forward into his own adult life, and the story that future generations would need to remember when they face their own moments of testing. The choice between courage and comfort, between justice and convenience, between standing up and standing aside, would come to every person in every generation, and the decisions they made would determine whether the sacrifices of Jacob Sterling and those who stood with him had been worth the price they paid. The fire crackled lower in the hearth as grandfather and great-grandson sat in comfortable silence, both understanding that some stories are too important to end with simple words like, "the end." Some stories continue as long as people remember them, and some lessons remain relevant as long as human beings must choose between right and wrong in a world where the outcome is never guaranteed but the choice itself remains sacred.